I haven't known Joe long, but I did learn that he had his first garden back in 1970 with 6 tomato plants. Then he moved to Clintonville, where he and Marianne grew rhododendrons and azaleas, which is a feat to do. His enjoyment of plants grew from there, and he purchased his first conifer, a hemlock, in 2000 at the nursery, Essentially English Gardens on Summit Street. His love for conifers exploded in 2003 with the garden that he started in Hilliard. In 2006, he joined the American Conifer Society. In 2009, he moved to Groveport, where he and his wife, Marianne, have over 170 different species of conifers and other plants on their property. They became Franklin County Master Garden Volunteers in 2020, and then Chadwick Volunteers, and are now the new volunteer leads for the Lane Avenue Gardens. Let's give a warm welcome to Joe Stewart.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. You can see the beauty of the Chadwick in that slide, that even the deer love to come and visit. Fortunately, deer don't tend to like the conifers, so now they will if it's a relatively young 1 to 2 inch caliper with no side branches. The males will tend to rut on that, but you typically don't have to worry about the deer eating your conifers. Why would you grow a conifer? Well, conifers, of course, are cone bearing plants. I don't think there's any type of plant that offers more interesting species. If you like the weird and the unusual, conifers are definitely your spot for you. I mean, they add color, shape, texture. A conifer garden by itself is very nice. We have a mixed border where we have our perennials, annuals, small trees, and conifers, and they all fit in quite nicely. And there's a number of shapes. You have your broad upright, which is sort of like the Christmas tree state, columnar, which is a gradual tapering column, cushion or bun shaped, globose, mounding, sweeping branches, narrow upright, prostrate. They grow all different kind of ways here. And you can also, you can take a conifer and with rebar and cable ties, you can make it turn whichever way you want, and it'll do fine here for you. Now let's see here now when these slides were working for me earlier. Let's see if we can figure out how to get this one to go to the next slide here. Okay. Well, when we checked this, it was working, but my enter key is not working on that now. Let's see. There we go. This is an example of a narrow upright spruce. I like the narrow upright. Typically the pendula is one. The columnaris, fastigia. You have pretty much unlimited space going up toward the sky, but typically with these these type of conifers, the height to weight ratio is anywhere from 5 to 7 or 8 to 1. So basically it's very narrow, and that the one next to that is a Japanese white pine, which is more of the traditional Christmas tree shape here. Come on, slide. Okay, this pine is Chief Joseph. Of course, I had to have it because of the name. Also, this particular plant is probably the most coveted plant in the American Conifer Society if you live in an area where you can grow it. It changes its winter color, this yellow, starting in late October with the first hint of cool weather, and will stay that way into typically the end of April. This is a broad upright or oval conifer. This, like I say, unfortunately, this one, I was looking for some prices there at Conifer Kingdom, which is a mail order in West Ontario, in Oregon. A 6 to 7 foot Chief Joseph runs for about $1,800, which is kind of crazy, but they're very hard to propagate. So that's one of the reasons that they're expensive. But this is an absolutely must-have conifer for us collectors here. There's globe shaped. This is a Picea pungens or blue spruce. This particular one happens to be on a standard. Americans tend to like these plants. As I've heard them described as basically this is a tree on a stick. And the nice thing, of course, is you can underplant that with hostas and things. I did want to talk while we have this blue Spruce Picea pungens on the slide. There's a disease that's going through the Midwest called needle cast. It's a fungus that is affecting the blue spruce, and a lot of the specialty nurseries are no longer selling these. It affects mainly the straight species. What happens? It's a fungus that affects the 3-year-old needles. It starts at the bottom of the tree and the inside and works out. So what you have to do if your tree is affected is you'll spray them with a daconil or a copper fungicide when the needles are about halfway out. Repeat that again 3 to 4 weeks later, and if you still have the wet, humid weather, a third time, and over gradually you can typically save this plant. But it's really ruining the blue spruces throughout the Midwest, because we are not Colorado, where this plant is native to. The Canadian hemlock is a mounding or a weeping plant. It typically does not have a general leader. It just tends to grow in different places. The one on the left is the one that I have at my place. Those are typically pruned after the new growth starts. You can just sort of snip them if they're going this way and here. But the beauty also of the hemlock is that this is a conifer that can grow in the shade. Most conifers want to be full sun, ideally 6 to 8 hours plus, but the hemlock that goes fine either on the north side of the house or also in the shade underneath trees and things. So it's got a soft texture, and it's a really nice plant. This Chinese juniper, the one on the right is my plant. It's one of those ones that's an upright, columnar, or irregular. A couple of years ago, I had some people that were visiting my open garden, and they looked at that plant and said it sort of looks a little bit like a cat in a hat. But there's another specimen. They just grow every which way, and they're really unusual. I just my wife Marianne, when I first started collecting conifers, thought that these were the ugliest plants you could possibly have. And over the years, she's fallen in love with them. But they're just great plants, and need to have them here. So they also come in weeping forms. This is an eastern white pine called Angel Falls. What I do with this plant is I'll take a 10-foot rebar, put about 2 feet in the ground, and then I'll cable tie it up. And once it reaches the top of the rebar, I'll let it weep down here. So this one is still pretty narrow in the top. At the bottom, it's got a spread of about 3 feet. Great plant. This is a Norway spruce called acre. That its claim to fame, is that the cones are born on the end of these branches. And then I have to keep mine pruned, especially laterally. I can allow the branches to grow up a little bit. If you're fortunate enough to have enough space, then you can have this a Norway spruce plant and let it go without pruning. I have to do a lot of pruning to keep mine inside. One of the things you find is that once your conifers are touching, then one of them has to go. Probably the best example of this would be some of the subdivisions where they've planted a screen of either Norway spruce or blue spruce. And if you look inside, on the inside of the two plants where they're touching, there's no light getting in. So for example, if you got a plant on the left, the right side has no growth, and on the plant on the right, the left side. So what happens if one of them dies? You've got a plant that doesn't look good, and you essentially have a domino effect where you're losing more plants on that. So basically, conifers never stop growing. People ask me, how big will it get? Well, if a conifer stops growing, it's because it's dead. So the question to ask is, what is its growth rate? So when you see a tag, when you're at the nursery, look at it for a plant, it'll give you a range of maybe 8 to 10 feet. Well, that's a 10-year size. And sometimes the variability as much as, say 2 inches to 6 inches a year. If you're fortunate enough to live in the state of Oregon or Washington, which is the ideal conifer area, then you're probably going to grow in that higher range of 6 inches, where in Ohio and the Midwest, typically that may be 1 or 2, which actually, depending on your perspective, can be a good thing, because You know, it'd be nice if you could say grow, 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 and then stop. But no, they continue to grow throughout their lifetime. Okay. Serbian spruce. The one on the left, I got in Washington State in 2007, and it was a pendula, which was not staked, so it crawled around the ground. So it was meandering through the bed, and Marianne decided that she didn't like that, so she put the rebars. And this is her project right now. So she's got she's basically got these cable ties and the rebars. You know, you leave them for about a year and a half, 2 years, and they'll stay that way. And so I'm not sure what the final creation is going to be, but this is a really nice plant. The one on the right is more of a typical pendula Serbian spruce. They are really nice plants, very hardy, and do well in our area and throughout a large part of the country. Okay. There's also ground cover or creeping conifers. This is a juniper horizontalis mother lode. When I first started collecting conifers, I'm never going to have junipers, and I'm never going to have a taxus because they're just basic, thing. But I mean, to me, this is a spring color where it's really yellow, but it's yellow throughout the entire year. So it started in 2009. It was a clump. It was about 2.5 feet in diameter, and it's spread all the way through this Norway spruce here that's by it, and then it's gone through the arborvitae over there. And to me, this is a whole lot better than a ground cover, whether it's pachysandra or ivy. I mean, if you got a sunny spot and have something like this, you got winter interest, and you don't have to worry about winter burn on that here. So there again, an example of a prostrate or a ground covering conifer. Here we got they're conifers. The sizes, they're miniatures, which grow less than 1 inch a year. And if you want a lot of conifers in a small space, the miniatures are the way to go. I think I have 2 or 3 of those. The downsides for me is they typically grow into little balls and they're not that unusual. I tend to avoid it. The dwarf is where I have most of mine in the 1 to 6 inch range. The intermediate ones can grow 6 to 12, and a large conifer will grow greater than 12 inches a year. So basically, the question to ask is not how big it will get. The question is, what's its growth rate? And like I say, the plant label is a 10-year average on this plant here. So, conifers like almost, like that, moist, well-drained soil, which of course is not typical of our soils in Ohio. When you're planting conifer, you can add up to 20% of mammoths, sphagnum peat moss or conmos. You don't want to go over that, because basically that plant, once it gets outside, it has to live in the soil that you have. I made the mistake, not with the conifer, but with a tricolored beech, that I really super amended a hole, and this was back in 2003. And of course, it was surrounded by clay. When we got a heavy rain, it filled in and the plant drowned. So, and conifers, a serious problem if you have a drainage. You can find out how much of a drainage problem you have. You dig a hole that's 12 inches across and 12 inches deep, fill it with water, let it drain 12 hours, and then fill it again. And it should drain in 2 to 3 hours. If it does not, then you have a drainage problem. The nice thing about conifers is that you can plant that root ball about 2 to 3 inches above the ground. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but then you can take a little bit of soil and taper it with good soil to cover it with the root flare. And of course, the tops of slopes on top of hills are a much better job for conifers. There are conifers that do like a wet space, such as your bald cypress, your larix, and some of the drawing a blank on that guy. I think the next slide has a list of some of those here. But okay, when it comes to fertilizing, I don't fertilize my conifers. Basically, when I created my beds, I used good garden soil. It was a combination of Kirch Brothers and Jones Super Soil, and then I just basically built. I'm in a subdivision that typically had your clay. It was originally a farm field. And when they got done building the house, it had the clay. So about 6 inches of depth. It's been quite successful. Now, if you do want to add fertilizer to conifers, Osmocote is probably the thing to use, but you do want to do your fertilizer application based on results of a soil test. In terms of mulch, my mulch of choice are the pine bark mini nuggets. The regular mulch also works. Pine bark mulch is great. It's a great soil amendment, but it typically doesn't last more than a year. And the big nuggets, I don't like the look of that, so I avoid those. I don't like hardwood mulch, especially for conifers, because it can stay too wet, and then the summertime when it's hot and dry, it forms a crust and it won't allow the water to penetrate through. Another great mulch, if you can find it for conifers, are fallen pine needles. I think it's very nice looking. It makes a great mulch. And if you can find a neighbor, a friend, or something that has the pine needles that doesn't want them, scoop them up and use them in your garden. You'll love them for it here. So it makes a great mulch here. Watering conifer. Okay, conifers, like any newly installed trees, water is very critical. For they need the equivalent of 1 inch of weekly rain from the first time you plant it until the ground freezes in the winter. For those of you that do not have a rain gauge, I certainly encourage you to get one, because especially with the winter thunderstorms, the airport might get an inch of rain, inch and a half of rain, and you got nothing. So you want to make sure that you get that 1 inch week for the first 2 years from the time you plant that until the ground freezes. Most conifers, which are evergreen, continue to transpire and breach, so they need that water in the winter. So because if not, they can dry out. So that will certainly damage them there. After their first 2 seasons, the conifers are typically drought tolerant, and it's better to err on the side of drying as opposed to being too wet. And as I mentioned before, the bald cypress, Don redwood, and the eastern white cedar are plants that will take more of a wet soil. So if you have that situation, those are easy to grow. The problem, with the Don redwoods are that it's a very big tree. I mean, this is a picture of Ogon here, and as you can see, it gets pretty tall. But that particular plant, by Don redwood comparisons, is a small plant. And so I've got one in the back of my garden, and I think that I can enjoy it for a number of years before it would get too big on that here. So, but it's absolutely wonderful plant for the conifers here. As far as pruning, the nice thing about pruning, especially if you have a mixed bed, is that your pruning is typically done in the dormant period, which is basically from late winter to early spring. So in most years, we don't have the snow cover. So this February, I didn't get a whole lot done. We had some nice days in January that I went out and did some pruning, and then March was the time where I did most of my pruning. And except for the pines, which you do later in the year when they start candling, my pruning is pretty well done. So when you prune a spruce, a fir, Douglas fir, what you do to reduce the size of that plant is you can prune it back to a lateral branch where 2 branches come up the main branch. On these 3 species, the dormant buds are visible and pretty easy to find. You can also cut in front of that. The plants that are thick, like the junipers, arborvitae, you can do a light pruning to reduce their size to bring it back to scale. Now, what you have to make sure with these particular plants is that inside, because it doesn't get any light, there's an area called the dead zone. If you make the mistake of pruning into that area, it will not regenerate. So basically, what you want to do is, when it starts getting the size, do an annual pruning on that. I think, coming up, we've got some pictures that sort of point out those. The taxus or the yews and hemlocks, they can be done after the new growth has emerged in the spring. So those can be done when they're actually growing. This is a shot here from Chadwick. If you haven't walked around the Arboretum, on Lane Avenue, I mean, this is the area that I truly love. Another thing to go through a garden like this is that they've got more space, so that I see some of the similar species there that I have, and mine are much smaller. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, if mine ever get that big, my 170 conifers is probably going to go down to 50, because with, like I say, as mentioned previously, once they touch, they got to go, and sometimes those choices are going to be very hard to do. But there's a blue spruce in there. There's I think that is the Ogon Don redwood in the background. There's a fir a little bit to the left of that, some pine. I mean, they've got a fabulous collection. And you know what, other than parking in the parking lot, and which is not very expensive, it doesn't cost you a thing to walk around that and see these plants here. Here is a Norway spruce. As you can see, the dormant buds on the left picture, that's if you cut that branch as we show on the slide on the right, then the new growth will come in, and that will you can take your plant back to size, and that will fill it in. If you do an extensive pruning, it may take 2 to 3 years to really come back, but at the end of that, if it's out of balance, at the end of 2 or 3 years, you're going to be very happy that you did it. It's just a great time here. But here's an example. This is an arborvitae and that's an example of the dead zone. If you do happen to cut back into that area, that plant will not grow back. Where basically you just you cut to a live above a bud there, and you can scale it back, and it'll do really fine here. So fortunately, here's a blue spruce, Picea pungens, and the Taxus baccata. There again, this is another plant. The Taxus, as I mentioned previously, that I think of Taxus as these foundation plants. Well, the Taxus baccata is a really cool plant. And another beauty of the Taxus is it's another conifer that you can grow in the shade. And so basically this one you can do a little snip here and there to keep it, where it needs to go here on that. But there again, you would cut by the branches or look for the dormant buds on those guys. And this is all done during the dormant period. Like I say, to me, in a normal February, you get one of those 45, 50 degree days, you've got cabin fever, absolutely perfect time to go out and prune your conifers. And, when you're done and you've got your hostas and things, they're still sleeping. So basically, if you have both conifers and a mixed garden with perennials, you're not doing all of them at the same time. The exception, of course, are the pines. The new growth on pines is called candles, and they will extend out. And you can cut those back to a third up to a half without hurting the plant, and it will actually grow thicker and keep it in track, so you can have more plants together. I have an occasion gone beyond the half and taken a little bit more, but it's probably not recommended as a beginner that you do that. But you can keep them in check that way here. So beautiful plants. Here again, this is the abies, a fir. You would cut between the two lateral branches. And then on the right is a hemlock, where you can, pretty much if there's a branch that's growing, especially the hemlock or sugas, they typically do not have a central leader. So, they'll grow in which way, and basically you're in control for both the size and shape of that plant here. So, a lot of fun. If you want to, as far as easy plants to take care of, your pines, your spruces, your junipers, probably the easiest to begin with. I mean, they're pretty, dependable. Most of those plants are hardy, anywhere from zone 5, which is -20, and some are even hardy down to zone 4 and zone 3. the hemlock and the arborvitae are, are fairly easy to take care of. I don't know that the arboretum has the sky dot, the Japanese umbrella pine, but that's another one that's done really well for me. As you notice, in my collection, I do not have any true cedars, Deciduous. I mean, a lot of the common names for cedars are basically any plant that's fragrant. So the arborvitaes, some of those fall into the cedars, and they're hardy. But when I was collecting, first start, my mentor said, Joe, one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to grow the cedrus because they don't like our winters. You're not going to be able to have good luck with them. Well, I listened to him for about 10 years and I bought one. And it lived 2 years before the winter killed it. Now, if you are in a protected area like Chadwick has a Deodora cedrus that has done very well. They've had it a long time. Probably if you live, say, an area like German Village where they're small, where they're fences, they're protected against the wind, you may be able to get away with the cedars, but I wouldn't try it. I know when I was initially looking for microclimates in this garden when we set it up, on a clear, cold night in the wintertime, there's a 12-degree difference between my house and the back of the garden, and it slopes down. So basically, it also collects frost and that easy. So, the cedars, but firs can be difficult also, not because of the winter. I mean, they can take a winter that would freeze every pipe in Columbus that wouldn't thaw out for a month, because they can typically take -40, -50. But they don't like our hot, humid summers, and they can be very challenging to grow. I know that was another species that, my friend said, Joe, I wouldn't grow the firs because they don't like our hot summers. So there again, I listened to him actually, I was here when I bought 4 firs from Conifer Kingdom. It's a good reputable nursery online, and none of them made it past the first summer. And I think it was in 2015 in the Columbus area. In the fall, the American Conifer Society Central Region had their meeting here, so we toured some of the other gardens around the area, and I saw all these wonderful firs that were pretty substantial size that people had. And I'm thinking, how are they doing it? Well, the thing that they had in common, that they were purchased at Dave Danhurst Landscape in Galena, Ohio. And for me, that's the only place that I would shop for firs. And I probably have now about 6 in my collection, and they're doing quite well. The 2 possible selections for are the Abies coriander, the Korean fir, Horseman Silverlock. That's been a very dependable conifer for me and for other people that I know. And the other one, the Abies balsam, it's a balsam fir. We can't see that down at the bottom. It's like a variety Phanolepsis. I lost a balsam fir, but I've had this particular variety one now for about 9 years, and it's stood up, and we've had some hot summers during that period. So firs are difficult, but if you have a source like Dave, you can get some good firs, and because they are, the nice thing about the firs, they're very soft to the touch, where the spruces are kind of ouchy. But so these are ones that now we'll talk about some different sources and things here. Here locally, you can find conifers at Oakland Nursery, various locations. You can Wilson's Garden Center in Newark has some great conifers. Siebenthaler's in Centerville near Dayton. All of these nurseries offer a 1-year guarantee on their plants. And if you're just starting out, that's probably a good thing to do. Now, the specialty nurseries that do their own grafting, and a lot of time they cannot afford to offer warranties, so there aren't any. But I mean, Danaher's in Galena, Sealy's in Hilliard, Gee Farms, which is in Stockbridge, Michigan. Those are great sources for a lot of conifers. You can get, if you want the unusual ones, that's what you got to go. But I mean, like I say, I've got a lot of things at Wilson's that I've picked up. Right now, I visited Sealy's about a month ago. I was in the area just to look around. All of the plants that they have currently that I wanted, I already had. There were some that I didn't. Now, but Sealy's is where I got my Chief Joseph pine, and I'm loving it. It's been in the garden 3 years and thriving on for me. So, Sealy's, if you go there, they'll look, if they can find a plant, they'll get it for you. Like I say, Oakland's, I was, when they had their spring fling sale, they had some nice specimens. I've got a small species of Norway spruce that I said, well, I could wait, on that, but theirs was a little pricey, but certainly in my range. I had one that there's the rabbits, with they basically turned my broad upright into a narrow upright. I think it's going to come back with the dormant buds, but they certainly pruned it a whole lot more than I would have liked to here. So, it's these are great places. There's also. Now we'll talk a little bit. These are some of the pictures. I think this was one of those warm January days. I walked around Chadwick and just looked at some of the various specimens that they had. We'll go through those a little bit. And this one as a Moseri Scotch pine. The nice thing about this one is two things. In the wintertime, if you have it in a sunny location, what it really wants, this plant will also turn yellow. Not quite as bright as Chief Joseph. Another nice thing about this particular plant, it has two types of needles, and it's just really a cool plant. It's a broad upright, and it's done very well for them and for me as well. I think I've had mine about 8 or 9 years now, and it's getting a little shady, so it's not turning quite as yellow as it was, but still a very nice plant on that one here. So we'll go to the next one here. Another Scotch pine called Gold Coin. This is more of your an upright plant, but this one is another one that turns yellow. When you get this yellow with some of the greens, and especially you get snow on the ground, these things are just outstanding. Probably yellow. I mean, conifers, in the winter, yellow is probably the most common of the off greens. In terms of that, I mean, there's some that are white colored. I've got a Norway spruce called Rubrum spicata. That is the new growth for about 2 weeks is red, and it's a really cool plant here. I know some people don't really care for Latin botanical names, but when you're talking about specialty plants, you need to have that botanical name, because there's so many common names that you might not get the right one. All of my plants in the garden are labeled as to botanical name, where I got them, and the year that they were planted. So if people visit the garden to see the plants, that you can basically take your cell phone, take a picture, take that picture to the nursery and say, do you have this plant? And that way you can get just what you want here on that here. This is a plum yew. It's an upright plant. It's sort of like a taxus, except that it's upright, and it's just much cooler. It's just a lot more unusual. There again, any cultivar, fastigiata, means it's narrow in width, and there again, this one probably has about a 4-to-1 ratio of height to width, and it's a nice plant, and it has having a problem with rabbits eating that one, and the deer don't like it. It's a great plant here. So let's see what we got next coming up here. There again, a blue spruce. This one, Hope'sii, is a Picea pungens. I'd have to look at it again, to tell, looking whether that inside might be possibly the fungal disease that that's let me get that name of that crazy thing here. Basically, it's a rhizospora is the fungus that one has. I'm not sure if that one is a light situation or whether that one we'll take that out. But I know that Gee Farms in Michigan, they have bulldozed every one of their blue spruces and no longer sell it. they're just dying all over the area. The ones that tend to be globose seem to be resistant for it. I've got probably about 9 or 10 of my blue spruces. I think 2 seem to be affected by it. The beauty of the dwarfs is, you can easily get a tank spray and spray them. Whereas if you got a blue spruce that's 30, 40 feet tall, you can't spray that one. And unfortunately, especially the straight species are dying, and it's very unfortunate on that here. So Japanese red pine, Pinus densiflora. This is one of the variegated ones. Oculus draconis is a very nice. I found that this particular species tends to possibly winter burn if you got a very windy site. So what I do with a couple of mine is I went to Camellia Forest, and they've got a product that it's a wrap that's translucent. It's microfoam. It comes in sheets, and I'll take my tomato cages and wrap them around, and then you can also use burlap, which I use for like Japanese maples and things. But for my conifers, which are more of my babies, I like that microfoam, and you can buy it by the foot, and it does a really good job on those here. So if you don't have a windy site, then it's not so bad. Probably my very favorite species are the Japanese white pines, Pinus parviflora. They're anywhere, it's the one, that bluish color. I have some that grow about 1.5 inches a year. I've got some that also grow maybe 6 inches a year. And they haven't reached the point yet where I've had to prune them, but eventually I will here. Norway spruce, there again, acrocona. This is there again, it's forms of cones on the end of the growth here. So real nice plant. And there's a Don redwood. It's typically foliage is that greenish yellow, and it's a deciduous conifer like the bald cypress and the larch. It's got a great shape. Its botanical name is ogon, but typically it's known by gold rush in the trade. So they should have both names, but basically this is if you want a Don redwood that's not too big, but not a real mini one, this is a good alternative, and it's got that color that's really pretty. It turns that golden orangish color in the fall. Fantastic plant, and it's another tough as nails plant. And there again, this is another one that can take a wetter site on that here. So Canadian hemlocks. This is pendula. Basically, this one was not trained up. Basically, you can do whatever if you want a straight hemlock pendula. You can put a rebar and train it up, or you can let it mound. They typically say, as I mentioned, they have no central leader, so they just do their thing, and you can prune them basically a little bit here and there here. So, but hemlock, as I mentioned, is a great plant for the shade. The Pinus pumila glauca is a small, sort of a roundish conifer. Basically, you look inside, basically that needle drop on the pines is normal. A lot of people that are not that familiar with pines will say, oh my gosh, my tree is losing needles. What's the problem? That's just a normal needle drop. And to me, I mean, that's the stuff, if you got a friend that has a whole big stand of Eastern white pines, and they don't care for their needles. I think I went to a friend earlier in the year, and I got about probably 20 mulch bags full of needles, and they are just fabulous mulch. So I have them spread around the back of my property, and also I've taken some to church at the garden that we maintain over there. Jack pine, Uncle Foggy, he's a real weird one. I saw this plant last year, and what I'm hoping to do, because he's sprawled all over halfway across the sidewalk. That's just the way it grows. I'm hoping that I can find a place on this plant that's still flexible enough that I can bend it either to the left or right, put a rebar and let him continue on, because it would be a shame to have to cut him. So, my recommendation, if I can't do that, is tell people to walk around it, because it's just one of those really unusual plants, and I dearly love it here. So Bosnian pine, Pinus held. This one used to be recent, and I had to change a couple of my signs. It used to be Pinus leucodermis, and I don't know why they changed it to held. But the Bosnian pine, it's a very dense, sort of broad, upright plant. Does very well. I think this one is hardy down to zone 4. For those of you that have would be interested in growing conifers in troughs or containers. In our area, we can be as cold as a zone 5 or -20 in the winter. I know they've got it posted as a 6. I'm not ready to believe that quite yet. We haven't had enough years. If you want to put something in a trough, you want to make sure that it's hardy to at least zone 4, because if it were in the ground, above ground, it would be frozen in the ground as it would with and they'll be just fine. Just make sure that you keep them well watered on that one here. Another blue spruce called, blue kiss, Picea pungens. This one just sort of another one that grows a little bit irregular. There again, this one, some of the, this ones that have the particular cultivars, this one has, absolutely no problem with the fungus problem on that. It's just there again, here's a weeping, Eastern white pine. I don't know how old that one is, but it's really a nice specimen, and it's done really quite well here. This to me is the ideal shape of a Norway spruce, Picea aves pendula, with that single trunk and it's narrow. This is my signature plant in my front yard, and I really love it here. Now the next slide shows another Norway spruce, which was either intentionally pruned or damaged by wind or something, that basically the top got cut off. And when that happens, basically the side branches take off, and you get some really strange looking creatures. There are some arboretum throughout the United States that with these Norway spruces that have been this way, is they'll actually have a name for it, because it'll look like a figure in that. But there's nothing wrong with this plant. It just takes up more space. And like I say, if you like the unusual, Norway spruce is a fabulous plant too. And, the Pinus sembra, the Swiss, is another typical Christmas tree shape. It's got longer needles. It's done quite well. My particular one, which is called Nana, which is basically for dwarf, is starting to take out my one pathway. So I may have to eliminate the pathway where it's by, rather than take out the plant. But the stone pine is another one. I'm not a big fan of the Chamaecyparis obtusa. That should be an A, but this one, it gets a little winter burn. And some of I've got, the Nana in my garden. It's done all right. But we get a lot of wind, and it's not done as well for me. So unless you really like that look, this is not a plant that I would recommend for the beginner, because I don't think you're going to be real happy with it here. But there again, Pinus flux limber pine, Vanderwert's pyramid. This one has been left to grow. It's got enough space. Mine, I have, it wants to grow in my garden about 5 inches a year. I candle it down to about 2 inches a year. What I found, in comparison with this one, is that mine is thicker. Having done that, both plants are very healthy. But because I have to. But basically, when the pine candles, which is going to happen anywhere from late April to May, before the needles start opening, that's when you want to take, and you can use your fingers, you can use a pair of scissors or pruners to cut that back, and it will shorten it, keep it thicker, and you can enjoy your conifer much longer without competition for that here. But on that here, so the arboretum has done quite well with firs. This is a Caucasian or white fir habeas concolor. I've got one of the dwarfs that has done well for me now for 4 years. Like I say, they'll take any winter that we get. They just don't like the summers. But with the protection that they said, there are probably 4 or 5 of the firs that are large size that have been there a long time that have done quite well. So, you know, those of you that live further north, you probably have the advantage where you can have the true firs, the abies. Another Chinese juniper blue point. This one is sort of a narrow upright too on that one here. It's got a blue-green color. The one, if I'm correct, I think that the one in the back is a Dawn red. To the left is a Dawn redwood. This is probably a Norway spruce here on the right here. So that's what it looks like, and that's probably a Norway spruce on that one here. So the Korean pines have done very well. They've got that beautiful blue. This, you know, Morris blue has got that whitish blue look on it, and it's a wonderful plant. I probably have more species of pines than any other conifer in my collection, and every time I see access to a different, I guess it's specific epithet now. For us olders, it was genus and species. I try to see, okay, you know, where can I put it, and do I have room for it? So, you know, it's a good. There again, another fir tree that has done it just stunning. I mean, it's beautiful and soft, and I'll tell you, that's, you know, this was a January sky. You know, when you get a sky like that, and the temperature is not -10, you know, it's a good day here. This is a lacebark pine, Pinus pungiana. I don't have I think I took a picture, but didn't that mottled bark on that plant. It looks like camouflage as it ages. I've got one of these lacebark pines, which has been in a trough, which I made in the shape of a wicker clothes basket, that I've had there since about 2006, 2007. I'd have to check the tag to be sure, but it typically wants to grow 5 to 6 inches a year. And by being in the trough, it's only growing about 1 inch, and I've never had to root prune it. It's never had a problem. I've been, you know, good luck with that. But it definitely, if you want to plant a conifer in a container, they look good in the hypertufa troughs, and it definitely slows them down. I have one that I used to have in a trough that was growing very slowly, moved it out to the garden, and now it's growing pretty quickly here. Another Japanese red pine called Low Glow. So you know, it's just, I love them. They're just not any that I don't care for. They're just, you know, beautiful plants. This is a Scotch pine called Basiaga. This has been described as a telephone pole with a few side branches. I used to have this plant, but it was just, you know, the trees around it got too big and it was shaded, so I had to take that out. But it's basically, if you want a plant that's very narrow and tall, this is the one for you here. But there again, you know, anything with Fastigiata or columnaris, those are Engelmann spruce, Bush's lace, nice blue color. You know, that's, you know, when you think of green, you know, so you start looking at plants, you know, you think of green, and then you see a garden full of conifers, and there's every shade of green and blues, and they're just, this is a oriental spruce called Shadow's broom. Brooms are basically, they're pretty much, you know, round shape, but what happens to a tree is typically there's some kind of injury to it, whether it's a virus or something, and up in the tree, they'll form a little congested area that's very dense, and it stands out. And there are people that go around and collect these things. They'll take a shotgun and shoot it out of the sky, and then graft it. And that's how some of the new species are formed here. So, Japanese, this is a true, of all the Pinus parviflora, that this Adquox stroke only grows about an inch and a half a year, and it's a very lovely plant. Mine is more upright than this one, but there again, it's much younger than this one, but it's a great plant. And I think we finally, then we end up with the another jack pine. This is another ground cover one. So I mean, you can find specimens of conifers. You know, if you've got an area, you know, that you need to fill up a space, and it's got the sun, I mean, you know, perfect. You know, get a pine that's that travels across the ground, and you won't be sorry on that. So there again, this one you can't see it really, but this one, this tortuosa, it has that really convoluted foliage. I've got one that's called mini twists, which is more of a rounded. It looks like this one. It's about my specimen is about probably 4 foot wide and 3 feet tall, and it's got this contorted foliage all over it, and it's just a really, really enjoyable plant. And on that here, so okay, this is a plant. This is a true cedar, Cedrus deodora called Fuchs. That's probably the hardiest of the cedrus that I know. Basically, this one is surrounded by plants. So, I mean, but I wouldn't even think about putting that one in my ground. Now, if I lived in German Village, as I said, I would definitely. And this one is out of the wind, and obviously it's doing very well. They've got a younger species there that I think is recently planted, and I'm curious to see, what's going to happen when we have one of our more true winters, because, but I have one cedar that I keep in my garage. It's a garage plant. My half of the garage, it has plants that are not basically the outside is too cold, the inside's too hot. So right now, it's late enough in the season, early enough in the season, past the winter, that it's outside now, but basically it spends the winter in the garage. I tell people that my truck is rated for at least zone 5, and these plants aren't, so I don't park in the garage. And I basically have my half of the size. Another Japanese white pine. This is a little more congested, typical of what they grow. It's like I say, they're just really nice looking plants here on that here. So it's just really nice. And then this is a very old Japanese black or red pine, I'm sorry, called Umbracophorus. This one is trained and structured to have that, that trunk as it ages is a beautiful red color. And I have this specimen, and it's nowhere near this size. And I'm not sure what I'll do down the road, because I have a cluster of about 4 conifers that are close, that probably in about 4 to 5 years, I'm going to say, okay, who do we like the best? But this is, I believe, the last of the slides. I want to thank you for participation. Here's my email address. If you're in Groveport area, we're in Groveport. I can get you my address. We love visitors. I tell people that there are no locks, no dogs, no chains, anything in that. If it's not a scheduled open garden, the host may be out, the wheelbarrow be around, but I'd love to. We love people to show the garden here. The nice thing about that is you can see some of these specimens. As I mentioned, I got about 170 different ones. You can walk around and see. I really like that. Take a picture of the sign and try to find it. So I want to thank you for coming, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And I will warn you that if you start collecting conifers, it is very, very addictive.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Joe.
We've
got some questions.
Okay.
In the Q&A box, so we'll start there first.
All right.
Popular question: does the creeping juniper work in the shade or very part sun?
They want full. I mean, mine is actually it's on the north side of the house and gets probably late afternoon sun, probably 4 to 6 hours, and it's done quite well. I mean, it would be probably happier if it had the full day, but I mean, it's even though it doesn't get a full day, it's done quite well. I wouldn't put it in some deep shade, but if you can get it a half day sun, whether morning or afternoon, it probably should be fine for you. And like I say, it's just and it's readily available at Lowe's, Home Depot. It's pretty easy to find.
Yeah, that was a popular question, where to get plants. So I'm glad you had that. Next one. Do you recommend coffee grounds as a fertilizer for conifers?
Conifer, it's more. It does have some acidic factor. I look at it as more of adding organic matter to your soil. I mean, in Ohio, the pH of the soil is so high that it's really really hard to buffer. But basically, I mean, it will help. A lot of my plants that really like the acid, I'll use sulfur instead. once or twice a year, but coffee grounds certainly, and Starbucks, most of the Starbucks will give you bags of their grounds. And I mean, if nothing else, put them in your compost or put them around your plants, because it's organic matter and it's good for the soil.
Do you incorporate it in there?
I usually, I've got the mini nuggets. So basically with watering, it's down, underneath the mulch into the soil. But I mean, incorporating it, if you don't have the mulch would be fine. Absolutely.
Which conifer are deer proof or deer resistant?
Well, deer rarely bother conifers as far as eating them. I don't have a conifer, or I don't have a deer probably in my conifer collection. I do work up in Powwow in one of the gardens, and she has probably maybe 30 to 35 specimens. And she has deer all the time. I mean, in fact, she feeds them apples, and they have never eaten any of her conifers. She did have a tall eastern white pine, which was limbed up about 4 feet. And during the mating season, the deer came in and rutted it and killed it. When it was replaced, what I did starting last part of August, I built about a 4 feet cage out of a hardware cloth and put it around it. And that kept the deer away from rutting it. But as far as damage, I think it's because, first of all, they're not very attractive to them as far as taste. And with the deer not having upper teeth, they have to, pretty much tear it, especially, if you go for a spruce, I mean, they're really ouchy. So I think, they stay away from them.
Okay.
Now, rabbits are a wholly different thing. I had a lot of damage from rabbits this year.
So they like the conifers.
Well, they don't eat them. They sometimes take, like I say, I had a couple that they just, chewed off the branches, left them on the ground. I think I was probably more upset with the rabbits. I brought home a black spruce from Alaska, and it was doing, it's a very slow growing conifer, and it was probably maybe a foot tall. I basically filled, there were area where we were staying in Denali. They were going to bulldoze these out. So I said, can I take these plants and dig them up? They said, sure. So I put them in my suitcase and sent them home. I lost one, and the other one was doing very well. And I came out one morning, and at that 45-degree angle, just right at the base of it, was just laying there. They didn't eat it, but they destroyed it. So there's 2 of them left. And the one lady, I'm in her will that if something happens to her, I get that plant back. But I've not, deer is minimal damage.
Okay. Next question we've got. There was 2 questions about native Ohio trees.
Okay.
Conifers.
There are a few native conifers.
Resources.
There aren't too many of the specialties that are available. When you think about Hocking Hills in southeastern Ohio, those hemlocks are all native. There are some of the there are native. Let's see here where there's taxus. Some of them are there's some of the pines, the larches. Mm-hmm. When I'm looking at conifers, I'm not really that interested in a native thing. I've got some of my native shrubs and perennials and things. But basically, if it's hardy in my zone and I like it, I'm going to buy it regardless. And I will try, for example, if it's used to the rocks somewhere, I'll try to maybe plant rocks on, with the plant to try and match the conditions. But native plants with my conifers, and especially ones, I don't really pay attention to natives. And they're great. The bees and butterflies typically don't really hang around conifers that much. Now, for example, the conifer here where it's open, it's a great place for protection, and it's also a nice place to make less. So the birds get enjoyment out of them. Mm-hmm. But the natives, don't really care for much of the conifers for that here.
So is there any truth to the rumor that pine needles impact acidity in soil when it breaks down?
It's minimal acidity, and there again, it's probably more native. But it's interesting. The cost of mulch is all in transportation, because if you think about it, down in the Carolinas where they have lots of pine trees, it's cheaper than dirt, basically. But if you want to buy a bale of pine needles up here, it's very expensive. Now, hardwood mulch around here is very cheap relatively, but if you want to buy hardwood mulch down further south, you pay dearly for it too. So it's, but I mean, like I say, if you know somebody that's got a stand of pine, eastern white pine trees, whether it's a church or it's a business. I mean, I've knocked on doors of business and say, do you mind if I go pick up the needles under your tree? And most of the time they say, sure, to help yourself. I've got an area back, which used to be our natural area, which is in the easement. And basically that one is all mulched with pine needles. And I really, I like the look, and didn't pay a thing for them here.
So next question, when you will need to remove a conifer due to like tight spacing, do you have success in propagating new plant? I guess, how would you?
I have never tried grafting myself. I know there's classes for it. You can't, put them in a rooting hormone in soil or water. You do have to grout them through some rootstock. There are people that are extremely good at that. So I've, now, there are some of my plants, I've contacted Dave Danaher and said, would you like to have some of this plant? And he might come out and take some cuttings and graft it. But by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that. When you want to move that conifer, the first thing is you want to do it during the dormant period. So that's something you're going to do there again, like the pruning. You're going to do it from late winter to early spring. You want to start about 6 to 8 months prior to moving it in the fall, and basically go out, depending on the size of the plant, and do some root pruning. Just take a spade and go down 6 inches if you can, and cut some of those major roots. What that will do, it'll encourage the feeder roots, which are closer to the trunk, to develop. And then you take the plant out in the late winter, early spring. It's typically February, March project. I had planned on moving 4 or 5 of mine and never got around to it. So I've got it on my calendar this year that I have to root prune about 4 of my conifers because they have to be moved. And usually if they've only been in the ground under 5-6 years, it's not that difficult to do. If you try to move a plant that's been in the ground 10-15 years, the success rate is going to be pretty low on that. But the younger ones, you can certainly move them.
Okay. We'll do one last question here. We had a bunch of questions about containers.
Okay.
So let's talk about what kind of plants, what conifers to use in containers.
Okay. Well, like I say, the first thing criteria is it has to be hardy to at least one zone colder than where you live. For example, if you're a zone 5, you want to grow a zone 4 plant or colder. I've got some large hypertufa troughs that I use for mine, and they've been very happy. 8 to 10 years. It slows them down. I mean, like I say, I've got one of my conifers that should in the ground grow 6 inches a year that grows an inch or less. I had one that was called Angel that was in a trough that was growing about a ½ inch a year, and now it's growing in the ground. It's growing about 4 inches a year. So it was, so I mean,
like bonsai.
The troughs definitely, and they do quite nicely, and they look good too. So,
any issues in the summertime?
Once they're established, I mean, they can typically go 3 to 4 weeks without water. If it's an extended, really hot, you do have to water them more frequently than the ones in the ground. But you can go away for vacation for 2 weeks, and your conifers in a container will be just fine.
Okay. Thank you, Joe.
You're quite welcome.
Hand that over to Julia.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe and Megan. As you all can see, it's our volunteers who really make this all possible. Joe, that was wonderful. You've got a lot of people singing your praises in the chat box. Everyone, please put in a thank you as you exit tonight. We will be following up with you all with a flyer for our next presentation, so you can have those handy in your email.
Mark
And
DeBerg on lilacs is an absolutely fabulous speaker. And he's got, I mean, when he gave away some plant, I got a lilac from him last spring that's native to Finland. So that's my outside the United States plant.
perfect plug, Joe. I love that. Yes, it'll be great to have Mark DeBard here next month and Akiva Silver. Thank you all so much for coming. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.
Good night, everybody.